Something a little bit different today. I've come all the way to Tasmania to do this episode of A Beer with Starlo, but to catch up with a bloke that's been a mate of mine for over 35 years. I think it must go back about that far, Rory, when I first moved to Gerringong in about 86. And you'd been there for quite a few years already, and you were one of the first people I met there, being a mad keen fisho, and you were already well and truly into your competition fishing and everything else. What year did you end up moving down to Gerringong full time?
Got married in 75 and we moved in 75. Jenny and I bought a 2-bedroom fibro place down at the end of Werry Beach, close to the water, close to the lagoon down there, and it meant that instead of coming down and staying in a combi on a block of land, we had a house to go to. So it very quickly turned into our permanent residence, and we've been there basically ever since until last year when we moved down to Tassie.
And you obviously got in with a bunch of other very keen fishers when you moved to Gerringong and got involved in the club and everything, got into competition fishing.
Oh, I did. I mean, I remember when you moved down, we sort of caught up, and I was pretty pleased to see you because I'd always followed your writing and everything. And I remember Ron Calcutt at one stage doing an editorial, being very critical of competition fishermen, and I felt strongly enough about it at the time to get in there and write a letter, and I think you sort of got a bit involved as well. And although I don't hold a lot of the views that I did then, at the time I guess it's like everything that's changed in this world. I mean, comedians now can't do the same comedy as they were doing 20 or 25 years ago. So many things have changed. The political correctness has changed. Attitudes have changed, including mine in a lot of ways. I still go out and enjoy catching a feeder fish. That's my principal love. I always feel pleased that I can go out and catch a feeder fish for the family. But yeah, so in those early days, the first bloke I ran into was Terry Cronin, Mick Cronin's, the footballer's brother. And I remember I'd caught a couple of snapper off one of the local headlands in Gerringong, and I'd asked Jenny to come down to the front of the beach so that I could take some pictures with the water behind me. And this bloke on a horse came just walking down and looked at me and looked at the fish and said, "Where'd you get them?" And we sort of started to have a bit of a chat, and we talked, and we became really good friends from that time onwards. And that led to him, he was in the local fishing club. He said that I should join the local fishing club. And in those days it was a really good vehicle for people to learn how to fish. I mean, I thought I was a pretty good fisherman at that stage, and I didn't know anything compared to what these guys knew, and I realised that once I joined the club. It really opened my eyes to just see how skillful these blokes were and how keen they were. And yeah, it's been a learning curve since then.
Well, it was an eye-opener for me too, to move there and fish with, I mean, obviously good fishermen, but also driven fishermen, guys who would go out and fish in a competition and target. And it was all about getting your bag limits of as many different species as you could. So it wasn't any good being a single species specialist, was it? You had to be pretty good at everything, and they were.
No, that's right. I mean, the comps in those days were pretty rugged affairs. In fact, that's what probably stirred me up more when Ron put in a pretty hard word about the competition fishermen, calling us the lowest common denominators and sort of thing, because I thought there was no recognition of the skill and the endurance that was required. I mean, now it might look silly, but in those days there was a fair amount of work and preparation went into these competitions. You know, our competitions at the Gerringong Fishing Club would start at 6 o'clock on a Friday night, and the weigh-in would be at 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. And the really keen blokes, and there were plenty of them in those days in Gerringong, would basically fish the whole of that time with maybe grabbing a 3 or 4 hours sleep somewhere, and you know, and that also involved being able to fish tides for different species, different locations for different species. Certain things would bite better at this time, this tide, and the really good guys were really hard to ever beat in these competitions because they were, as you said, they were pretty driven, and they had a lot of skill. They'd learned a lot of things, and all of it was probably learnt from being a member of the club and sharing all those skills that people had. Some were better at snapper fishing, some were better at rock blackfish fishing, some were luderick fishermen. But by combining all the skills and the knowledge that they had, you would end up a pretty good all-round fisherman.
Some of them were better at passing on their knowledge than others too. I mean, some of them it was a bit hard to get much out of them unless you watched them fairly closely.
Yeah, but that's right. some blokes that were very secretive about their spots, and there were other blokes that were very open to encouraging them to fish better. I mean, in the early days, one of the biggest encouragers for me was John Prosser, who's left us now, but John was well known throughout the AFCA as the recorder, and that was a lifelong love that he had of just fishing. And
now, I know you did a lot of small boat fishing in those days and beach launches and all that kind of thing, but what I remember most, of course, is the rock fishing, and I learnt so much about rock fishing by fishing with you and Terry Cronin and guys like that for drummer and brim and blackfish around the rocks. Oh, we had a few hairy moments. I can remember fishing at night and getting pretty wet and cold and everything, but did you ever have any close calls over the years? Did you ever get bowled over or washed in at all?
I've fished a lot of time and put in a lot of hours on the rocks, but I've never ever been bowled over, but I have been so close to probably never coming home again. And that was when 4 of us were fishing in the South Coast rock competition one evening, and any of the spots that I fished I'd have been confident of going to in the right conditions. But on this occasion we had a big southerly buster come through. When night time came, the southerly had come through, and it's what a real southerly buster used to be. It was really blowing. The clouds we had nearly a full moon, and they were just skidding past on top. And John Prosser and Alan Griffiths, who Terry and I were fishing with at the time, said, "Come on, we'll go close to a place close to Old Man's Hat, which is down in Jarvis Bay." I'd never been there before, and so we walked out there in the dark, and John reassured Terry and I, because he'd fished it many times with Alan Griffiths, reassured us that he'd never ever got his feet wet at this particular spot. And so Terry and I, rigged up and we started throwing, and both Terry and I were uneasy about this spot because we just didn't know anything about it, and we could see in the moonlight every so often some huge swells pushing past this particular spot. But we had a wave that came in and lapped at our feet, and I said to John, "John, I thought you'd never got your feet wet here." And he said, "Well, it's a first for me." I said, "Well, I'm not comfortable here." I said, "Can we go up a bit higher?" So we probably moved another 5 minutes higher to the next tier that we could get onto. We then had one that came up and washed us to our knees on that higher mark, which would have inundated us on the first had we not have moved on that. And that also came with, I think, being sensible enough to have been on the rocks before and seen how dangerous things can get, and we were cautious straight away when that happened. So we moved up probably about another 7 or 8 metres again after that one, and then there was this enormous sucking back sound, and I just thought, this does not sound good, and we were all a bit frightened. John had moved a bit round the corner, and Terry and I were on a ledge, and we just decided to stand up back against the rock ledge. We couldn't go anywhere at this stage, and we just gripped the rock platform, and we had a wave that came through there. I remember I didn't lose my feet, but Terry did, but he had a good enough hold into the wall that his feet actually hit me in the face with the water. That was a pretty scary experience, and really there was no way, from the height that we were at that time, we'd have probably been dead before we'd have hit the water by falling through the rocks and the surge taking us down there. We had a roll call immediately straight after that. We'd lost several rods, we'd lost gear, we'd lost our fish and everything else. So we then went back up on top, and that really took the wind out of me and Terry. But John Prosser, to his, I don't know whether you'd call it credit or stupidity, just said, "Well, it won't get us up here," and he had another throw. So you've got to be very, very careful, and even the most experienced people can miscalculate or do something foolish. And in that case, I don't think Terry and I would ever have gone there, not knowing it, but you put your trust in somebody else, and sometimes they miscalculate. So
things like that teach you a few lessons, don't they?
Oh, they sure do. And that, I think that really has helped me for the rest of my rock fishing life. I mean, I've always been very careful about, people will see me in sometimes clothes that they wouldn't have thought were appropriate for rock fishing. But I always looked at what would happen if I was washed in. Where would I go? Where would I get out? And this is before I went out and had my first throw, even though I didn't think that was likely to happen. But you could usually tell, what the sea was doing and where your get-outs were. And for that reason, I think, even though I've been in times when I had water up to my waist and washing backwards towards the cliff face, But spending so much time on the rocks, you know how to face it, how to lean into it, not to panic. The worst thing that you can do is suddenly run when you know, you don't know, you think you might be able to reach a place, but you're off balance. When you're running and that water comes across that's waist deep, you lose control. That's probably
far better to turn face into it and
exactly.
step into it as it hits you, aren't you, and have your balance and brace.
And we did that a few times on a couple of rock ledges.
Plenty of times with you, and you'd have to sort of throw your hip into a wall of water, but you knew that particular spot, there wasn't a lot of power in that water. It wasn't going to take you off your feet.
That's right.
It comes down to experience, doesn't it? Now, complete change of pace. I should explain where we are. We're actually at Rory's house in Primrose Sands, about 45 minutes from the CBD of Hobart, and I've got to say, it's one of the most wonderful places to have a house. That's his boat ramp down there behind us. It's all of about, 80 metres as the Corella flies from here. It's a lovely part of the world. You've been here a year or so now, but you'd spent a bit of time in Tasmania before that. Well, tell us how you're finding Tasmania. It's a bit different to Gerringong.
It's a lot different to Gerringong, mate, and I've spent a full winter here now. Actually, we came down in 2013, just after I retired, and we spent a year living at another little place called South Arm, which was up near the mouth of the Derwent, and Jenny and I both really enjoyed that. And one of our, my daughter Renee, with her partner, moved down here probably about 12 years ago. She then had 2 children, which gave us 2 grandchildren. And then my other daughter, Martine, decided to come down to Tasmania to be closer to her sister as well. So that meant that we ended up with 4 grandchildren down here. She had 2 of her own as well. We got to the point where we decided it was time for a change. The prices in Gerringong were pretty good at the time, and we thought we could probably give ourselves a reasonable retirement by coming down here, because it was a lot cheaper to buy property down here. But one of the main conditions was, as you know, when we were in Gerringong, we always had a view, and that's been very important to Jenny and I basically since we were married. Yeah, so this place came up and we just thought, well, it's going to be hard to get a better view than this. It's a lovely area, it's a quiet area, but yet we're still close enough to Hobart to be able to get into the city and do things that we need to do. The fishing, well, there's still a little bit to
still got a bit to learn
about here. Yeah.
You don't seem to have too much trouble going and catching a feed of fish, though.
No, that's one thing I was surprised. When I first came down here, everybody told me that, all we'd get out here were flathead, and then probably some more flathead. I started fishing down here and I really didn't know what to do. I mean, as you can see by the back here, it's just like one massive lake. It's not always like this. I mean, it cuts up pretty badly, but it's a big body of water down here, Frederick Henry Bay, and it's kind of, in a way, just a bit like if you lived, I suppose, down at St George's Basin, where you've got a big expanse of water. It's not really open to the sea effectively, except by a small entrance, so you don't get the same sort of swell. But fishing smooth water like this is really different to what I've been used to, because around the rocks you can always sort of work out spots where you think fish will be holding, and you can burley. This is a completely different environment with a completely different lot of fish. I mean, as you know, yesterday we had a fairly reasonable day at the boat. We didn't catch anything spectacular, but I mean, we've got about 6 or 7 different species, I think.
At least.
And so I'm learning. The trout fishing is another thing that I'd like to put a little bit more time into. That takes a little bit more preparation, and also is very much more dependent on the weather at times.
And a bit of travel. I mean, your closest is probably at least an hour away, isn't it?
Probably
trout fishing.
Really an hour and a half, I think.
Which is still a bit of a luxury compared to a lot of people in Australia who are a lot further from reasonable trout fishing than that. So you've sort of got it on your doorstep. But the squid is what you've been really impressing me with. You've become the squid king of Primrose Sands. I think you don't seem to miss out too often on those. You loved your squid fishing up in Gerringong, but would you think it's more consistent down here?
Oh, definitely. Squidding down here has just been amazing. But there's only so much squidding or squid that you can use. And even though, it's something that I can do in the morning when you get still days like this, you can pretty much guarantee yourself the squid. The kids all love their calamari. Jenny and I love it. So we eat fairly, regular amounts of it. But, I think that the more I learn about the calamari fishing around here, the better it's getting. Yeah. And it's become very easy now to basically just go out in the morning you know, if you get mornings like this, 3 or 4 squid is enough, and I'll usually get that in an hour and a half if they're quiet, or in 4 throws if they're on the job.
Yeah.
And they seem to be on the job nearly as much as they're not, so yeah, they're pretty good.
And since you've been down here, you found a few people from the mainland and old friends and that come down for a visit?
Well, COVID's put a bit of a dampener on that. I mean, we had plans for a lot of people from Gerringong that were going to come down in the last 12 months that haven't been able to make it. I mean, we haven't been able to catch up for quite a while too. In fact, we had this trip planned 12 months ago.
A year ago, yeah.
Yeah, so
finally got it together.
yeah, but we've got some from Prince coming down next week, so that'll be really good. And
good.
We're going to go back to the mainland for a couple of months in May. So,
well, I'll be down again, mate. I've really enjoyed it. I'll drink to that.
Cheers, mate.
Cheers.
Good catching up.